Welcome, everyone. My name is Leila Hassini. Bonjour à tous, merhaba bikoum. We're so thrilled to be here in Morocco and to be in North Africa in the amazing city of Marrakesh. My name is Leila Hassini. I'm an Algerian American feminist, and I'm thrilled to be here with this esteemed group of panelists. We're going to hear about their work at the national, regional, Pan-African, and global levels, the work that they're doing to transform philanthropy and to situate gender justice in all that we do. And I want to thank the African Philanthropy Forum for welcoming a session that centers gender justice. So we are not referring to gender equality or gender equity. Those are very important, but they're not sufficient. And we're situating this panel from the perspective of gender justice. And let me just say a few words about language. And to frame what Moki said yesterday, we need better stories and stories that are told better and that use the language that represents the work that we do and the people that we serve. So justice is about examining the systemic root causes of discriminatory practices and dismantling societal, legal, and cultural barriers to gender discrimination, equality, and violence. We adopt an intersectional lens in our analysis, and in the words of Audre Lorde, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So gender justice is not about a sector or a theme. It is about all people and centering them in the work that we do. And so while women's rights organizations and gender justice movements are leading the charge on many of the issues that affect global development on the continent, they are severely underfunded, as we've heard from others. Less than 1% of ODA goes to women's organizations and 2% of philanthropic dollars. And if we use an intersectional approach, as the Black Feminist Fund has shown, the funding that goes to Black women and girls is between 0.1% and 0.035%. So just let those issues, those numbers sink in for a minute. Women are advancing some of the most important changes and addressing some of the most important development and social justice issues on the continent, but they are severely underfunded. And so today we are going to talk about what difference does funding in a feminist way and funding gender justice organizations and movements and issues make across the African continent. We're going to give examples of the difference that makes. And then we're going to talk about what strategies have proven to be effective and to have made a difference, and that what more do we need to do? We do not want to reunite again next year with nothing changed. And so what do we need the philanthropic sector to do? How do we need to be funded? What kinds of partnerships and collaborations do we need to move gender justice forward in a different way? So I'm thrilled to be part of this incredible esteemed panel. I'm going to start with a question about examples of where the resourcing of women's groups has resulted in transformational change. And transformational change is the change that we're looking for. And I'm going to begin with you, Nosha. We're in Morocco, the country that you are from, and you have a deep history as a gender justice advocate, as a politician, as a researcher. Can you give us some examples of how women's organizations have been organizing around gender justice in Morocco? And Nosha will be speaking in French.
Salam, bonjour, hello everybody. Just a few words in English, just to say I'm thrilled to be here with these eminent experts, and welcome to Morocco. Thank you for Mosul for her engagement, commitment, and congratulations for the African Philanthropy Forum. Maintenant, je vais parler en français, c'est la langue qui est la plus pratiquée en Afrique du Nord. Et j'aimerais parler un petit peu du Maroc, parce que peut-être vous n'êtes pas très familier avec ce qui se passe au Maroc. Mais j'aimerais aussi dire combien les projets pour les femmes sont importants pour participer à leur développement. Cependant, aucun projet ne peut, sur le long terme, donner de très bons résultats si les femmes n'ont pas leurs droits. Donc, je voudrais mettre au cœur des questions la question des droits des femmes. La question des droits des femmes, c'est tout simplement de bénéficier d'une citoyenneté à part entière sur le même pied d'égalité que les hommes. Et ça a été notre combat depuis plusieurs décennies au Maroc. Ces décennies au Maroc, je n'ai pas le temps de faire justement un bilan des activités et des différentes réformes, mais je voudrais juste parler du statut personnel que nous considérons comme un élément fondamental. La clé de développement des femmes, c'est la question du statut personnel. Actuellement, le statut personnel connaît une réforme qui a été d'ailleurs appelée par la plus haute autorité du pays, par le roi du Maroc, qui a appelé en 2022 à une réforme profonde pour justement s'aligner sur le développement international. Nous avons des engagements au niveau international. Nous sommes signataires de la CEDAW. Nous sommes signataires de plusieurs engagements à l'échelle internationale, mais des efforts doivent être consentis. Je voudrais citer peut-être deux éléments pour ne pas prendre beaucoup de temps. C'est la question du mariage des filles mineures. Je pense que c'est une question fondamentale. La question nous sommes signataires également de la Convention sur les droits des enfants, et nous savons que les enfants, leur place avant l'âge de 18 ans, leur place est dans l'école. On a parlé de l'éducation, de l'importance de l'éducation des filles pour justement développer nos pays. Donc la question du mariage des mineurs est une question fondamentale sur laquelle les ONG féminines sont unanimes. Il faut absolument la criminaliser, l'interdire pour permettre aux filles de assumer et d'être tout simplement prises en charge dans une école pour leur permettre un avenir, l'avenir qu'elles méritent. Le deuxième point, c'est l'accès des femmes aux postes de décision, aussi bien politique, économique et sociale. Et là, permettez-moi juste de dire que j'étais ministre de la condition de la femme, la première femme ministre au Maroc, et on a mis le paquet sur la question de l'accès des femmes aux décisions politiques. Nous étions à 0,07% au Parlement, mais grâce à trois piliers, à la fois une volonté politique. Ça, c'est très important. C'est pour ça qu'on a beaucoup parlé des gouvernements. La volonté politique a été exprimée au plus haut niveau. Deuxièmement, l'engagement du gouvernement. Et donc, j'étais là avec un premier ministre qui avait soutenu cette question. Et enfin, mais la pièce la plus importante également, c'est la mobilisation de la société civile. Personne ne peut réussir seul, sauf si on est ensemble. Et c'est là où intervient la question de la philanthropie. Parce que pour réaliser la démocratie ou l'égalité, cela a un coût. Et le coût a besoin de financement. Et la philanthropie, elle agit là où les financements traditionnels ont échoué. Donc, j'appelle de tous mes vœux à renforcer davantage ces mécanismes pour donner le maximum de choses à la société civile pour jouer son rôle.
Thank you so much, Nozha, for raising the key issues of equality in rights, but also in practice, and the important role of governments as duty bearers and civil society as organizers. Françoise, I'm coming to you, and please introduce yourself. Nozha, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. But Françoise, I'd like to ask you, as the head of the African Women's Development Fund that will be celebrating 25 years of feminist funding next year. Round of applause, please, and everyone be ready for the celebration. Can you give us some examples, Françoise, of how you've been working to support gender justice organizations and movements across the continent?
Right, thank you. So yes, you've already introduced me, so I'm just going to go straight to the point by first acknowledging what you said about 25 years of feminist funding, to say that this conversation is not new about gender justice. It's not a new buzzword. And, you know, when our co-founders, and I want to acknowledge BC Fayemi, who is here with us as one of our co-founders, who almost 25 years ago was saying, we're not seeing for our work the funding that meets our needs and allows us to materialize our vision, right? So I was excited to come to this session because of that framing that you spoke about, Leila, of gender justice. Because the work that drives us is based on a vision where all people should have all their rights at all times, regardless of any consideration about their gender, right? So what Nusa said about rights being fundamental to this work is very, very critical. To answer your question, to give maybe one example, I would like to share an example from the Gambia, a recent example actually. Because of the vision I've mentioned, I think it's important to keep in mind that what we're trying to do is transform society. It's only in a transformed society that we can have all those rights for all people at all times, right? So if I give the example of the Gambia, in 2015, for those of us who have been working on ending female genital mutilation, the Gambian feminist movement scored a massive win by getting the National Assembly to criminalize female genital mutilation. It's a mouthful, I'll say FGM. Last year, we started hearing news that they wanted to decriminalize, which is a major issue, not only for the million of girls who are going to go through the pain and the consequences of of being mutilated, but also of what it means for society. You know, we talked earlier about education and health. You know, when a girl gets mutilated, the next stop is child marriage. You just spoke about it, Nusa. The next stop sometimes is death because they bleed right there on that table. So all of our goals about health and all that and education and good schools, if the girls are dying, you know, on that table, that's like, we need to go back to where the people are and getting their full rights. So last year, we're hearing they might just decriminalize it and going back to a time when anybody can just cut a girl at any time. And what we quickly did is working with many other funders, including feminist funders from and in our continent, to fund the women's rights organizations, activists, and networks to do the work that they need in terms of influencing, advocating, and they successfully stopped this by convincing, in the end, the National Assembly not to vote. And that took a few things that I want to share quickly before I end. Lessons from that I want to share is that what makes this funding transformational is that it's about creating a whole environment, not just looking at one issue, but the whole environment for gender justice. Secondly, the responsiveness and the flexibility and the trust. In that situation, it wasn't about saying, please send us your table with your budget. In that kind of context, we have to go with trusting the people who we know can do this work and can lead this work. Last but not least, also transformative being working and funding for them to work together. Not a single organization in the Gambia could have done this on their own, right? And so that means that we need to fund what keeps them together, the solidarity, the sisterhood, togetherness, and the care. So I'll stop here for now from that example.
Thank you, Françoise. And just capturing the nature of transformative philanthropy and what is meant by that and how it's trust-based and responsive to what communities need and to the intersectional nature of the issues that women's groups are addressing. Kemi, I'm going to come to you now. And your work has resulted in a transformation in our understanding and depth of domestic abuse. And notably during the COVID pandemic, you wrote about and spoke about the shadow pandemic and gave visibility to the shadow pandemic as well as responses to it. Can you say a little bit more about that, how you mobilized, what lessons you learned, and what is important about that today?
Yes, of course. Good afternoon, everyone. So my organization, the Women at Risk International Foundation, is a nonprofit that works out of Nigeria. And we address the prevalence of gender-based violence, as Leila alluded to. And this we've done intentionally for 7 years. Although my background is healthcare, I'm an OBGYN specialist, so I've been working in the space pretty much for about 30 years across 3 continents. To put context to Nigeria, and most of us know it's the most populated country on the continent. 49% of us are women. So of the 236 million people that Chairman Wenger mentioned, half of us are women. And we are a young country, like most countries on the continent. So about 65% of us are under the age of 24. And yes, our median age is 17. And 1 in 4 girls of that population under the age of 18 would experience at least 1 violent sexual encounter. So those are the numbers that we're working with in Nigeria. And these numbers are similar, and I'm sure comparable to many countries across the continent. So when we talk about the impact of women groups or organizations like ours, I would probably, as you rightly said, constrain myself to the pandemic and the COVID response that we were able to implement. So Nigeria is 54% rural. One of the primary services that we offer at the organization is offering essential services to survivors. And so we have rape crisis centers that give primary treatment, counseling, and welfare, because Nigeria is not a welfare country, so she can't go home, pick up the phone and call for housing, and she can't call for a lawyer. And we do this by offering these services predominantly in urban centers, as well as assisting other state governments to run their own specialized centers. But then what happens to the 54% that live in the rural communities? Because they can't access these centers. Many of them are struggling with basic infrastructure. However, the 1 in 4 statistic still applies. So when we had the COVID pandemic, like with most other countries, we had our mandatory lockdowns. And so we had more women, survivors, trapped at home with their abusers. We had children that were sent home from school, and school was actually their safe spaces. So when they got home, sadly, the perpetrator was the caregiver in these home settings. And these rural women didn't have access to phones, nor did they have centers that they could visit to address their concerns. Now, as an organization, we had recognized prior to COVID the need to access healthcare in these rural communities by working with the stakeholders in these communities, the informal healthcare providers. They're known as traditional birth attendants in Nigeria. I believe other countries have different names like doulas. And these women are the trusted caregivers in many of these settings. Admittedly, if I leave on my OBGYN hat, I can tell you a laundry list of problems I may have with her, but I can't ignore the role she serves. So we engaged these women and we started to train them. Back in 2017, we started with 500 of these women, showing them toolkits and training them to be first responders to cases of these violent children and women and intimate partner nature. And we started to see the ripple effect. They started to refer cases to centers. The first year, we had 200 cases from areas that we never would have heard from. Fast forward to 2024, we're up to 12,000 across different states. But the interesting thing that you mentioned, Leila, was during COVID. Because during COVID, we couldn't access the women trapped in these homes in these rural communities. And they didn't have phones to call, and their neighbors couldn't visit because they weren't allowed to leave. But we had our traditional birth attendants that we had trained. And so we could galvanize them by sending them WhatsApp messages on their WhatsApp groups. to say to them, please go into your communities and please start to see and check on your women folk. And in that first year in 2020, we were able to access 150,000 homes that we wouldn't ordinarily have seen or been able to assist. So that speaks to the impact of women-led organizations or women groups in addressing transformative changes, especially in communities like I just described. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kemi. And again, the importance of direct funding to women's groups, as well as working with trusted healthcare providers and community members. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you now. And if you could say a little bit about Mothers to Mothers and how you structure your work to ensure that the work that you do is led by local women's groups and that you're moving resources directly to them around the priorities that they have. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. And I'm delighted to be here on this esteemed panel, and thank you to APF for inviting us. So for those of you who don't know, Mothers to Mothers is a South African headquartered integrated community health charity. We were founded over 20 years ago, and we were founded critically to stop the vertical transmission of HIV from mother to child. But we do that through a model that I think actually really speaks closely to what you were just saying, Kemi. It's training and critically paying women to deliver the community healthcare services themselves. The ripple effect that you spoke about is something that we've seen across our work. By paying women for the work that they're doing, they have economic power. They're able to build houses, they're able to send their children to school. They also have control over household income in a way that in some places just maybe hasn't been a reality for them. And what I would say is that M2M, and I'm relatively new to M2M, but I've kind of looked at the model across the space for a long time. They've done that despite many funders saying you should not pay community health workers. Why can they not work as volunteers? Or your programs are so very expensive, we can't fund them. So that is kind of a transformation that we've been able to kind of bring about. And I say we, it is really the women on the ground delivering the work are in over 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have really made that possible. So we've paid a living wage to over 12,000 women. We've reached 16 million people and saved the lives of 3 million women and children through that model that M2M has kind of brought into being. I think the other thing just to kind of highlight, and it kind of came up in the conversation yesterday, and something that I just think is really, really important to kind of bear in mind is that, you know, whilst the women are delivering the work, they also kind of have the agency, and we need to be putting them in position of power within our organizations so that they are the ones kind of deciding where the funding goes, what the programming looks like, and kind of being a really important part of that journey of more collaborative philanthropy. So yeah, back to you, Leila. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for highlighting the importance of agency, strategy, who's defining the agenda, and on what terms that's being funded. So these are just a few examples, and there's so many others that we can share. And please go to the websites of the organizations that are part of this panel, because there's so much to share and our time is limited. But even though we know that funding directly at the local level and funding from a gender justice frame is transformative and has transformational possibility, many of the funders are moving out of the women's rights and gender space, and we are in a political movement that is super challenging. And so I'd like each of the panelists, and I'm just going to move a little bit more quickly given our time, to address what you think we need to do to keep gender justice at the center of philanthropic efforts. And Françoise, I'm going to begin with you and then move this way across the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. I really think that to keep gender justice at the center of philanthropic efforts, philanthropy needs to fund those whose work puts gender justice at the center, right? And those actors exist. They've been there. So it's not about creating a new shiny something, mechanism or actors or whatever it is that we like to create. It's just looking at who has been doing this work in a transformative way. And from my experience, these are women's rights activists, women's rights organizations, feminist movements, and gender justice movements in general. And to do that specifically, I would be maybe a bit prescriptive, but let me just say I would like to be very clear. First, we need to trust them with larger amounts of money, right? We cannot ask them to transform society and give them crumbs to do it. It's not going to work. What they've been able to do so far, thank you for them, what they've been able to do so far has been not because of the funding they've received, but truly in spite of it. Secondly, we need to give them this funding with the modalities, better modalities that are more adapted to that gender justice lens. No, I don't know how we can try to free ourselves from oppression using lock frames. It's just not going to work, right? That's not how liberation works. So you trust them to tell us what impact looks like in their context and follow their leads. Thirdly, I think we should make sure to invest not just in their organizations or their initiatives or their projects, but also invest in their resilience, right? I want to quickly share an example of an organization we work with in Malawi, work with women with disabilities, who they started as a very informal group. We provided like training on financial management, just helping grow the organization. And today they're becoming one of the key counterparts to their government. They are influencing policy. It's by growing and strengthening those organizations that the work, that actual transformation happens. And lastly, invest in both their narratives, and Moki said a lot about that, but also invest in their togetherness, their solidarity, because only together can we have that transformation. So I will stop here. I know we're out of time, so I'll say that.
Thank you so much, Françoise. Great examples of what we need to do and how we need to fund differently to achieve the transformational change we all seek. Nosha, I'll come to you now.
Merci Leïla. Je ne me suis pas présentée, donc permettez-moi juste de dire que je suis marocaine. Je suis Senior Fellow au Policy Center for the New South, which is a Moroccan think tank. Mais nous sommes dans un écosystème, le think tank est dans un écosystème avec l'Université Mohamed VI Polytechnique. J'aimerais juste souligner que je travaille aussi dans ce cadre-là pour le Women's Empowerment. Nous avons un programme qui s'appelle Lead Campus que nous gérons avec HEC Paris et qui est dédié bien sûr à notre continent. Et donc juste vendredi où on essaie donc de travailler avec ces jeunes Africains et je mentore annuellement au moins une personne en Afrique. D'ailleurs, je suis en train, l'année dernière, j'ai mentoré une Africaine au Sénégal qui a monté un projet sur la question de la migration, vous en avez parlé tout à l'heure, comment développer un port de pêche pour éviter et pour freiner, par exemple, la formation, l'immigration clandestine. Donc, ça, c'est un programme où on se retrouve et on continue à travailler ensemble. La deuxième chose, c'est par rapport à l'exemple que j'ai donné tout à l'heure, où le travail entre gouvernement, société civile, a mené à l'implantation d'un quota pour l'accès des femmes aux postes de décision au Parlement. On est passé de 0,7 à 10%. Mais il ne faut pas prendre un projet dans le temps. Il faut qu'il soit durable. Et pour qu'il soit durable, Françoise parlait de confiance. Il faut que les femmes aussi puissent to build the self-trust, la confiance en elles-mêmes. Et c'est là où nous pouvons agir parce que il ne faut pas croire que le leadership, c'est juste les positions de top management. Le leadership, c'est à tous les niveaux. C'est au niveau local, c'est au niveau des petites communautés. Et ça, on doit mettre l'accent ensemble pour développer justement ce leadership au sein des petites localités. Et là, il y a un levier très important, c'est celui de la formation. C'est la formation où l'on peut agir ensemble, les ONG, avec les communautés locales, pour d'abord écouter leurs besoins, les faire participer au processus de design de tout projet depuis le début jusqu'à la fin, depuis le design jusqu'à la mise en œuvre, mais aussi l'évaluation. Il faut absolument que nous soyons conscientes et conscients tous que nous avons besoin de mettre en place un système d'accountability, parce que c'est ça qui va créer qui donnera une légitimité et qui permettra à long terme aux bailleurs de fonds, aux philanthropes de continuer d'accroître leur financement et de croire en nous.
Thank you, Nozha. Kemi?
Right. So I think the first thing is to put gender as a nexus. Gender is not a budget line item with any project. It should be part and parcel of every project, regardless of what it is, whether it's climate change, whether it's accessibility to healthcare, whether it's saving the whales. I would imagine women might do it better. I just believe that every and any project should have gender in the forefront. It shouldn't be a conversation. Secondly, when Françoise is going to give me all this money, yes, it should be, thank you very much, it should be funding that's long-term and unrestricted. Because you have funders that say to me, oh, you know, we expect you to have this systems change in 3 months. That's target-oriented. You need for me to have an impact-oriented analysis and view, so you need to give me the time and the funding to do so. Then the other thing Françoise needs to do is she then needs to consider me being in the room when she makes the decision on how to disperse the funding, because I'm implementing the program in the community. Perhaps even ask one of my community members to join me in that room, in that meeting. Otherwise, again, to effectively manage, to ensure that these programs are impacting as we would like to see, then we need to include all the decision makers at the meeting, in the room, as and when they occur. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Kemi. And I think both you and Nozha spoke to the importance of who decides, where are priorities set, how is programmatic work done, and how does it begin with the communities most impacted who are also bringing the solutions to change. Rebecca, I'd now like to come to you with the same question.
So I agree with what everyone else has said, essentially. So I didn't quite talk about my background. I've worked in the non-profit, NGO, humanitarian space for 15 years as, I guess, a high-value fundraising lead, but more increasingly as a philanthropy practitioner, as someone who kind of goes out there and tries to talk to not only philanthropists, but prospective philanthropists, and critically, I find at the moment, their advisors, to ensure that when people are coming to the table, when they're coming to the conversation, they're kind of coming armed with a bit of, they're coming with the right questions to ask. And I still feel that we're not quite where we need to be for some of that. And what the risk is, sorry, I know we're talking about solutions, but the risk of not doing that is that we're kind of at risk of perpetuating the same paternalistic models of funding that have existed for kind of all eternity. And I would hazard a guess that some of the huge challenges that we see in the world today on the African continent, including on the African continent, are often because women are not part of the conversation. I spent 6 years in the humanitarian world working with displaced people, and I think I can kind of, think of a number of different conflicts. Women are just not part of the conversation. So that really needs to change in order for funding to kind of flow in the right places. And I think just really recognizing the intersection of gender justice with so many other things. We're a health charity, but I guess the byproduct of what we do is not empowering women. Women are already empowered. It's giving the women the tools to kind of live the life in the way that they want to, but also changing the narrative around the funding and the way that we're kind of talking about women's work, about gender justice, in a way that kind of brings the stories to life of the reality that can be imagined if we do things in a better way.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to ask one more question of all the panelists and then invite the room to come up with your questions. So please think about them as our panelists answer this final question. And if not, I have others if you don't have questions. But I'll start with you, Kemi. So you've all given examples of what should be done. What is the vision for a well-resourced infrastructure and funding movement for generosity, for giving, and for philanthropy by and for Africans and African feminists and gender justice activists on the continent? So let's dream big. Kemi, what would you say are the key components and what needs to be done to better resource in the ways that we've described resourcing needs to be done?
Thank you. I think I'm going to lean into what Mr. Adeosun was saying earlier this morning. Africa funding Africa. I think that should be the buzzwords this afternoon. I'm happy to hear that in Nigeria we have ₦1 trillion, 21 trillion naira possibility with pension funds. So I'm going to go back home and look into that. How do we start to look for this, diverse, untapped resources as, women-led organizations so that we can start to see this transformative change? And I also think beyond that, we need to harness intersectionality. I think we speak about philanthropy as siloed projects. I think we have to start looking at all of the disenfranchised, marginalized groups and start to look at philanthropy through that one lens. So it's not just women, it's disabled women and men, it's children, it's education. I think we need to start looking at it more as a collective, cohesive problem. And then that way we can start to see the transformative change that we would like. Thank you.
Thank you. So Africans and Africa funding Africa, intersectional approach. Rebecca, what else would you add?
I would love to see the diaspora as part of that conversation as well, and thinking about how we can pull new funding into this space, encouraging those that are already funding in the gender justice movement to be a part of the conversation and to encourage others to come to the table. I would also really like to see kind of greater education around the impact of gender justice, but spaces to collaborate. And maybe that's funds like Francoise, for example, and kind of directing more funding there. But really kind of recognizing that, I think someone said this earlier, I'm sorry, I forgot who, but we can't do this alone. We're doing this as part of partnership with other people. We need to be complementary to each other. We need to kind of explore where there's collaboration, but also provide a safe space to have those really difficult conversations in some respects, to kind of enable that and build that ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Nozha?
C'est vrai, on est dans une plateforme avec un parterre absolument extraordinaire et unique. On parle de notre Afrique. Mais je voudrais penser grand et rêver grand. Parce que l'Afrique, c'est aussi des différences. Et c'est sur ces différences que nous devons bâtir aussi des visions à géométrie variable, mais unifiées. Quand je voyais hier la brochure où l'Afrique du Nord, il n'y avait pas grand-chose qui se faisait, ça m'a interpellée, où je me suis dit, voilà, aujourd'hui on est là, comment dépasser les clivages pour travailler tous ensemble abstraction faite de la langue, si on ne parle pas, on parle le même langage, c'est celui du développement pour notre continent. Et Françoise a bien dit hier, From Africa. From Africa, aujourd'hui, il y a les grands bailleurs avec nous, de grands philanthropes, donc travaillons ensemble parce que soyons conscients que la question de gender justice appelle à une réflexion profonde, qu'il ne s'agit pas d'une question des femmes. C'est une question éminemment politique, éminemment économique, éminemment sociale, et donc elle interpelle hommes et femmes de se pencher sur ces questions. J'appelle aussi à une justice climatique. Nous faisons face à des drames au niveau des changements climatiques et nous ne payons pas suffisamment attention aux femmes rurales. Réfléchissons ensemble pour tirer vers le haut. Il faut qu'il y ait un ascenseur social au niveau. C'est pour cela que je voudrais, Leïla, si tu permets, appeler à la création d'un fonds dédié aux femmes rurales où l'on pourrait ensemble trouver justement des alliés. Et là, la question des alliés est très importante. J'appelle aux alliés, hommes et femmes, les philanthropes, de se mettre ensemble pour réfléchir à un projet, ou je pense à un projet, par exemple, qui va s'appuyer sur les nouvelles technologies et l'intelligence artificielle pour la mise à la disposition des femmes rurales, peut-être une application capable de les aider, de les aider à affronter justement les changements climatiques, parce que je voudrais que ces femmes aient un impact sur le développement. Si on réduit par 25% le gap entre hommes et femmes sur le plan agriculture, nous allons, we will increase the GDP by 4%. Si on fill the gap by 50%, le GDP il va connaître une croissance de 8%. Et si on arrive à réaliser la parité, le gap, il sera réduit à 14%. Donc ça, c'est des chiffres, mais nous ne sommes pas que des chiffres. Nous sommes des forces humaines. Et ceci, j'appelle à travailler sur ces forces humaines, sur les alliances et sur la sororité africaine pour aller de l'avant.
Thank you, Nosha. Solidarity, cooperation, also the importance of climate, and you're highlighting the impact of inaction and what will happen if we don't move forward in an intersectional way, funding rural women, funding climate, which is really impacting Morocco in all kinds of ways, as well as other countries on the continent. So Françoise, can you address the question, what do we need to do for our future of philanthropy that is grounded in gender justice?
Right, thank you. I mean, the beauty of coming last is that a lot of what I wanted to say has already been covered. So I think, just so I'll be brief, I'll just say just a few things. Echoing the fact that this gender justice lens is not just about women or about girls, it's about society in general. So we have a responsibility to connect the dots. Right? And so that also means that where the funding comes from cannot just be the very small gender equality pot. We keep seeing this. We saw this with the Millennium Development Goals, and we panicked at the end because, we didn't get there. And how were we going to get there when, for example, an issue like child marriage, which affected 6 out of the 8 MDGs, was not being treated? We're now seeing 2030 coming, and there's the same panic around the SDGs. You look at the gender data, it's not being addressed. We need to connect the dots, and from a philanthropic perspective, if the work is on climate justice, it has to have a genderless. It is on narratives, it has to have a genderless. So just to make sure that we have that connection that is done, not only conceptually, but in the way we move the funding. Secondly, I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't replicate as we do from Africa for Africa. Completely agree with that. That's very critical. That we don't replicate the same trust gaps that we are experiencing from our allies and funding allies from the global north. I think this is critically important, especially when it comes to trusting women's rights and feminist organizations with a lot of money. Let's not have them jump to the same hoops that, we have had to jump through. And I want to say it can feel and be a bit intimidating to do this work. I'm here to say you don't have to do it because there is an existing infrastructure. If you don't know how to do feminist fundings, give your money to the feminist funds. That's what we do, right? But I want to say a last thing as you think about that. Kemi made a very good point about what we time and time again hear from our partners. We need more money, we need flexible money with long-term money. Most feminist funds are not endowed. We don't make our own money, we fundraise. If the money that we get is not flexible, it's not long-term, we cannot pass it on, right? So actually philanthropy has the key. And here we have a lot of corporate philanthropy. It's not like you are bilateral donors from government. You have to report back to the citizens and show which each sense. You make the rules. So make the rules in a way that shows that you're looking at transforming society, not just building hospitals that we can put our names on. What we're trying to do is really transform society, and you have that power by setting the rules, by listening and setting the rules that actually answer to what Kemi said. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Françoise. We have 11 minutes, so just hang on for 11 more minutes and then we'll break for lunch. We'd love to hear from you. What is this panel inspired? And I'll start here. 2 hands went up quickly and then I'll come to the right and the left of the room. So please, is there a mic that we can pass around? And we'll take a few questions and then I'll come to the panelists.
Thank you very much. I found this panel very interesting, but perhaps it's because I represent Boys to Men Foundation. And there are 2 things that occur to me. The first is that I think that very often philanthropy is reactive. It responds to something. Justice responds to something. I think also that a lot of the time, when we talk about gender, we think it's only women. Nobody has talked about the men that are beaten up by their wives or beaten up by girlfriends. And I think also that if we want to change things, we can't ignore the role that men play in terms of changing their mindset. Otherwise, we're going to keep dealing with the same issues. So what it is I think we need to think about how do we change the way that men think in a patriarchal society? How do we train them to look at equity in a certain way that is inclusive? Sometimes it's like survival of the fittest. People don't give up things unless you force them to, unless you engage with them and show them why it works better if we're all on the same page. And I think that's something that I really would like to see more of at these conferences. The idea that men have a very specific role to play, engaging them is important. So we're not always just treating people as opposed to just anticipating and dealing with issues before they come up. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we're sitting next to each other, we're having a conversation. So it's a bit similar, but I think that from a perspective of addressing legal reforms, we've seen some progress in that respect. The Maputo Protocol has been adopted by many African countries. There's been national legal reform, preserving women's rights, and in the corporate world as well, on structural biases. I think everyone acknowledges that those have been removed. I think what's left is that subconscious bias, speaking to stereotypes, changing cultural attitudes. And so my question is, how can African philanthropy address this? Are there initiatives that we can, visibly replicate? And more importantly, how do we measure progress in this respect? So you're talking about COVID, for example. COVID wiped off just 1 year most of the advancements that were made. Tells you that we're, what I'd say, maybe like our progress, let me just use the word progress again. Our progress is very fragile in this area. We haven't made much headway. And I think it is this subconscious bias, these changing cultural attitudes. And I'm not saying it's easy, it's very difficult, and that's why I'm asking the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, we need challenging questions. I saw a hand over here. Is it still up? And if not, yes, I'll come over to you. Yes, please stand up. Thank you.
Can I go ahead?
Hello, my name is Yuba, and I am an LGBTIQ plus activist, a queer activist advocating for gender equality and queer rights. And I'm so glad that the center of this session is an opportunity for us to talk about gender diversity. But also, I would like to mention some communities that are really left behind in so many settings like those, like gender diverse people who are sex workers, who are using drugs, who are living with HIV, and also living with disabilities, living in rural areas. Those are some people that we have to mention in such settings by names of the community. So I was thinking that, and based on my experience as a grassroots activist, and also working on a grassroots level, is that so many level and so many times the grassroots work is neglected, not necessarily by directly, but mostly by putting a lot of hurdles and not being flexible and not being impact and oriented and progress oriented. So my question is how we can collectively, as grassroots movements but also philanthropists, challenge the status quo and work for a better and more inclusive and intersectional continent, which is our continent, Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the question. Yes.
Thank you so much for the panel. My name is Jackie Odhiambo. I'm the founder and executive director of Nyanam Widows Rising in Kenya. And my question is also on inclusion related to what he has said. Widowed women are a group that is not always talked about when it comes to women's issue, even in funding and all of that. And I'm just wondering, from the experiences of the panelists, what are you seeing happening in this space, and how can we create more visibility about the experiences of widowed women and marshal more support for them? Thank you.
Okay, I think, yes.
Can I go, Leila?
Yes. Yes, please.
Hi, it's Hakima from the Black Feminist Fund. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to Yuba also, and to the sister for bringing in widowed women and LGBTI folks. What I'm hearing is that women are the solution to our continent, and that when women organize together, they address the systemic roots and root causes that we seem to be speeding headlong into in terms of these crises. And so that funding African feminist movements at large scale has to be philanthropy's big bet to solve all the crises, the climate crisis, the debt crisis, the economic crisis, and to create the public infrastructure and all of the things that we need on this continent. We know that the evidence shows this, but philanthropy continues to talk about micro whenever they talk about women, and about risk whenever they talk about people organizing for their rights. So what do we do, particularly in this room, what do we do for African philanthropists to shift that narrative around making small bets and really turn those into the big bets that are needed in terms of investment into African women and LGBTIQ organizing on the continent?
Thank you so much, Hakima. I'd like to come now to the panelists to respond to any of the questions. We have 3 minutes, so please be brief. Rebecca, I'll start with you, and I'll come around.
Men are a really important part of the solution, for sure. I think I was looking at a stat earlier, though, that concerns me, and I think it concerns me because we're not at the stage where we can remove funding for women's focused issues and gender justice. It's important, though, that men are brought into the conversation, and the stat is this. So of the 25.6 million people living with HIV on the African continent, 5.7 million of those are young women, so adolescent women. And that's 25% of new infections every single year, despite the fact that adolescent women make up just 10% of the population. So that's an outsized problem, and something that requires resourcing, and it requires investment in scaling solutions that already exist. And so I think to the final point of the final speaker, sorry, I didn't get your name. I think it's kind of more of what we've been saying. It's more kind of unrestricted funding. It's scaling up. It's not waiting. It's kind of just getting on with it, and finding those solutions and the groups and the collaboratives that already exist.
Thank you, Rebecca. Kemi?
Yeah, I think very quickly I'll speak to the questions that were asked from this table. I mean, as with all low middle income countries, we recognize our social drivers. There's a patriarchy, women are subjugated, we have cultural practices that encourage the violence. And so we know we need to tackle these social drivers if we're going to get to the root cause of why we have either the gender inequality or the violence that's perpetrated. And so we implement programs. Yes, there are initiatives and programs that are already being implemented. These programs speak to both boys, recognizing that you need to identify at that adolescent age group the mindset and change that mindset from being that potential perpetrator to being a protector. And that comes with educational school programs or out of school programs like mentoring programs. And with men, it's about identifying the beneficiary groups that already have spheres of influence in these communities, like traditional leaders or the religious leaders in many communities that we serve, and creating workshops where you can start to change the narrative by encouraging dialogue and encouraging the systems change that you want to see. So that, as you said, not just women, but men, and not just girls, but boys, do have this impact from the programs that we implement. So absolutely, it's one of the things that at least we do in our organization, and I know you do the same in yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Nosha?
Merci vraiment à la salle de toutes ces questions qui pointent du doigt cette intersectionnalité. Et au fait, c'est vrai, dès qu'on parle des femmes, ça ouvre la possibilité, bien que les femmes ne soient pas une minorité, puisqu'elles constituent 50% de la planète, mais ça ouvre la possibilité à parler justement d'autres problématiques qui se trouvent dans nos sociétés, mais qu'on invisibilise. C'est pour ça que la question de la femme est fondamentale pour ouvrir les portes à ces questions, pour traiter des questions intersexuelles et pour inclure et rendre visible justement toutes ces composantes de la société qui sont une force majeure, transformatrice et positive. Alors c'est pour cela que nous mettons, enfin, la main dans la main, nous continuons à travailler ensemble pour pouvoir faire justement de ce potentiel humain dans sa diversité une véritable richesse. Et je reviens juste pour finir un mot sur un levier puissant, c'est celui du narratif. Comment nous portons notre regard sur notre continent. Il faudrait que nous développions cette fierté à travers tous les instruments dont nous disposons. Dans le panel précédent, on a parlé de l'art et je considère que la question de l'art est un levier puissant pour montrer notre créativité, notre force. Alors travaillons et mettons tout ça en exergue.
Thank you. Françoise?
Yes, thank you. I guess I don't, this thing is blinking really, the timer. So I think I will say 4 things, just 4 words. The first is inclusion and intersectionality. So whether it's widowed women or LGBTQI people, you know, like when we look at gender, we don't look just at women. We look at, as I said earlier, all rights for all people, all the time, regardless of any considerations about their gender or their sexuality. So that's where I would start. Secondly, I would say broadening the base of who needs to be in the room, who needs to be taking action. What is the role of corporate philanthropy? What is the role of government? What is the role of civil society? We cannot put the responsibility only on one group to change the entire society. It's just setting people up for failure. Thirdly, I would say responsibility and co-responsibility. In the situation that we are in, we spoke about, the money just dwindling, and the availability of funding for gender justice dwindling and dwindling. What is our responsibility? Especially as African and African philanthropy, we cannot rely on Western philanthropy and then come and fill the gaps. We have that responsibility, and in this room, we have the means, the power. All we have to do is make a choice to own that responsibility. And my last word is urgency. We can talk about it. I can write many reports for all of you. But yesterday, when we came back from the lovely reception that we had, I read the news about Sudan, a village in Sudan where 130 women decided that they would rather die. They would rather die by suicide than being raped by the militia in their village, because those are their two options. There's a sense of urgency that I think we need to feel. We may not be in those villages, but these are our people. So it's our urgency, not just theirs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Françoise. So just leaving with, we have the means and the power and the funding, and philanthropy is all around us, and it's on the continent. If we could just move it in different ways, the impact could be transformative. A big thanks and a round of applause to this amazing group of speakers.